Firstly, please make sure if you're in the audience that your mobile phones are switched off or switched to silent. Secondly, please keep chattering to a minimum, if not, none at all. And thirdly, please only leave into the rooms in between speeches. And without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Here.
Can everybody hear me? There are a lot of wars going on in the world, but if you were to analyze those wars, there's one thing that they have in common. Oftentimes, it's larger countries with higher military power infiltrating or going into smaller countries which never stand a chance. I mean that this is as a result of the probability of success as a justification for going to that war. And we think that this is extremely unfair towards these smaller countries, and we think that a lot more wars happen in their world. So, two things I'll be talking about in my speech. One, what would these wars look like on the ground, and why do we think that this is not a just criteria? And secondly, how does this impact international relations and economic discussions between countries? Before we go on to those several issues, several categorizations or the counter-proposal in which side opening government would like to provide. We think that there's a list of other criteria that exist. One, in terms of proportionality, that the attack that you go or make onto other countries in terms of achieving your goal has to be proportionate to that threat. Secondly, is that discriminate killing, meaning that you have to only be able to attack like soldiers and you cannot attack civilians. Thirdly, is that the level of your attack has to still allow some form of post-war reconciliation. It means that you cannot destroy things that are crucial in rebuilding that country. Note that these three things, although they exist in the same list as the probability of success, the probability of success criteria is contradictory to them. Why is that necessarily true? Because probability of success means that in order for you to achieve your aim, you're willing to do whatever it takes in order for you to achieve that aim to begin with. That as long as you solve or you reach that aim, that war is then therefore justified. This oftentimes contradicts with the proportionality. Because you want to end that war as quick as possible, you tend to send more infantry on the ground, you tend to use more deadly weapons. It's also in contradiction to the discriminate killing. Because oftentimes, the people that are attacking, for example, the United States going into Afghanistan to deal with terrorism, also looks like these terrorists, they live among the civilians in the same house, but in order for you to kill those terrorists becoming your objective, you have to then therefore bomb that entire building, and we think that that will harm other individuals. Oftentimes also, in order for you to weaken your opponent and weaken or thank your enemy, you have to destroy the various structures which are crucial for that post-war reconciliation. Therefore, these things cannot exist with one another. They have to define a role in which, regardless of whatever you do, you're willing to go to the means of whatever it takes for you to achieve, the aim of that particular war. First issue about what would those wars necessarily look like? Because I think that one thing that we have to understand in this debate is that efficiency doesn't necessarily mean that it's just. What does this mean? We think that the criteria of what an efficient war particularly looks like, inside opposition's world, will be a war in which ends at the quickest of time, you achieve the aim quickly, basically, right?
What does this necessarily look like? It looks like a justification of them using things like drones, right? Because in the attempt of America to end terrorism in the Middle East, no thank you, and their probability of success, it means that they're willing to send drones and willing to send like people on the ground to do these kinds of things. But the amount of harm that it causes to other individuals who often get caught in the crossfire, and because people tend to not be as like careful as what they're doing because their aim is the main priority, we think that's when there's more likely for you to have that particular form of collateral. We think that also it justifies things like in their war, as long as a nuclear war is able for you to solve the outcomes or achieve the aims that you want, it therefore then becomes justified in their war. No, thank you. But what they don't consider is the amount of pain that it causes to individuals. Like for example, Bashar Assad, it used chemical weapons to suppress his opposition, which was then in that war, in order for him to achieve the goal of that particular war. He did not consider the amount of pain of which those chemical weapons caused to the victims of those particular wars as well. So we think that therefore, just because your war is efficient, it doesn't necessarily mean that those wars are particularly just. This also is likely to happen because in order for countries to go into war, they will fund their military even more because they want to increase the rates or the probability of their success. So we think that this also leads to your military having the ability for them to be corrupt when they're very highly funded, and we think that this is things that make the wars or make these wars problematic. And in order for them to justify those spendings, we think that that's when they're more likely to go even to more wars in order for them to justify themselves, and we think that that's also a problem as well. Before that, yeah, Syarif.
John, obviously we're not saying all efficient wars are just war. We're saying one of the criteria for a just war is that it has to be efficient.
Yeah, but we've already told you with the other criteria, they're contradictory and they cannot coexist. We have to put this at the priority of your criteria and at the expense of the other criteria. I think I've already given sufficient analysis as to why they cannot coexist. Secondly, in terms of the international relations and how does this necessarily look like? Because the reason why, like a lot of smaller countries, like a lot of Muslim countries, don't want to deal with the terrorist issues within the Middle East is that, for example, in Syria, the conflict between the Shia and Sunnis in Syria, the reason why other Muslim countries don't want to involve themselves is because Bashar Assad is backed by Russia, and the Sunnis on the ground, and the opposition towards Bashar Assad is backed by the United States. This means that there's an extremely low probability of success for these other countries in the instance in which they do engage in that particular war. So we think that the problem with this is that you restrict a lot of individuals, or a lot of countries, who could have been crucial to the discussions and the diplomacy and you achieving the aim of that, and you wanting to get like the outcome of that war, because they may not be successful into doing it. So we think that this also then translates into like your economic discussions. The reason why the largest economies in the world, the United States and China, are also the largest militaries in the world is in terms of your economic discussions between these two countries and your bilateral agreements, often is dependent, like small countries often are in the fear if they do not comply, these countries are able to then call a war upon them because the probability of success is a criteria which then makes that war particularly just. So therefore, because they will always be at the losing end in terms of military, it translates into them always being at the losing end in terms of economics as well. We think this is necessarily harmful because these are the countries that need the economic development the most, and we need to prevent that particular economic hegemony at the end of the day. So we think that probability of success should not be a criteria because it overrides the other criteria and it makes wars extremely painful, a lot of death, and extremely unjust.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech and I call upon Ella to continue the debate today. Thank you.
Judges?
If fighting in the face of surefire defeat means that the Rohingya unnecessarily throw their lives away, means that the Palestinians rely on using sticks and stones against the Israelite tanks, opening opposition willingly settles for hiding your trump cards and waiting for the time to strike. I'm going to do 3 things in my speech, but before that, I'm going to set the debate, which I think John did not do. Firstly, what is the context and type of wars we are talking about? I don't think it's country-to-country wars as John asserts. I think a more realistic comparison here is more things such as interventions, for example, in Yemen, and things such as resolving cross-civil wars in Syria. That is the current context that we're currently set in, and that's where the debate operates under. Secondly, how do you adjudicate this debate? Crucially, we have to ask ourselves, what should a just war look like? It should look like minimizing the amount of innocent civilian lives that are lost, but it also should look like ensuring the long-term post-reconstruction of the society. Because sure, a quick war might end war temporarily, but we have to ensure the ideological support for peace remains there to ensure that there's long-term basis for peace. So thirdly, as I alluded to in my introduction, our stance is very clear, is that we'll strike where the probability of success is high, and we'll give you reasons why organically waiting means that the probability of success will likely increase. Before I move on to my issues, let's first engage with John's ridiculous idea on how this 3 criterion cannot exist. I don't know, John. Maybe look at the last 150 years where the universe didn't implode upon all these criteria being met. I think it's reasonable to say that we experienced tremendous success in the past 150 years despite this criterion existing. For example, just look at Kosovo when NATO intervened in those areas. Just look at the myriad other places in which, for example, the UN intervened in those circumstances. Probably points to the fact that we can rely on this criterion to intermingle and interweave together. I don't see why they can't, and I think it's a decision insofar as it was asserted. 3 things then. First, how a reasonable chance of success is currently determined. I think John missed that. Secondly, why government side incentivizes prolonged wars, and why prolonged wars means you can't ever get the key post-war reconstruction that both sides of the house wants. And thirdly, comparatively, why waiting means you increase the probability of success. First, how is it that a reasonable chance of success is currently determined? Under the status quo, the UN General Assembly determines that chance of success based on 2 levels of criteria. First, the number of army forces that the rebel armies have that the UN are supporting versus the numbers that the side is willing to topple. This means the strength of the Free Syrian Army versus the strength of Bashar al-Assad's forces. This means the strength of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army versus the strength of the Burmese junta. Secondly, it also determines that chance based on the ideological support of people on the ground. This means the Sunnis in Syria, for example, and the Rohingya in Myanmar need to believe that war is just, need to believe that intervention of outside forces is necessary in order for the post-war reconstruction to occur. This is derived from research, and this means, so the reason why this is important in this debate is because we craft burdens for each side to discharge. This means Gulf has to defend a world where the chance is more 10 to 20%, where the number of forces is disproportionately lower than the other, where there's no or little ideological support, whereas Up defends a world where those 2 things are more met under outside the house, and it's a reasonable chance that these things are in fact there. So, secondly, why government incentivizes prolonged wars and why prolonged wars are necessarily horrible? We say that government pushes states to enter wars that will likely be unsuccessful. But what happens if you can't end a war quickly? 2 things happen. First, you're likely to resort to desperation to end the war, which pushes civilians into the fray. Because if your war is unsuccessful, it also means that you change the calculus of the losing side. You change the calculus of the winning side amidst that desperation. You resort to dirtier and dirtier tactics to end the war very quickly. So for example, it looks like the losing side starting using Palestinians as human shields in order to defend themselves, in order to get the ideological support, in order to get the scare tactic to win the war. It looks like people rely on guerrilla tactics which break homes in order to win that war because of the lower forces in numbers. Comparatively, if we don't intervene and we don't create a huge conflict in those areas, there's no reason to be as violent and desperate, because at least on the scale, there's less parties involved, which means that the conflict on a scale is less. But secondly, we also think that radicalization is more likely to occur if your chance of success is also very low. Firstly, why is this true? Firstly, know that the children in these places are more likely to grow up with the haunting memories of war. The fact that their parents were literally impaled on the streets and shot with bullet bombs and barrel bombs mean that their conception of what life is and what life should be is incredibly haunting. This pushes them with the ideological hope they want to end the war as soon as possible, which means that they're more likely to resort to terrorist groups such as ISIS. But secondly, because the economy is in shambles, you also push people into war as the only resort that they have left. They are pushed to that singular option of relying on war as a means to sustenance. Comparatively, outside of the house, at the very least, given that there's less conflict as a whole, you're more likely to not get those things, presumably because it is better. Like, the children don't grow up with the urgent, visceral nature of war, because on a scale, conflict is less. Why is this important? Because the post-war reconstruction is likely to be better under outside the house, where people don't necessarily already have a tangential belief to outside forces helping them. Under outside the house, we win the ideological fight that is needed for post-war reconstruction. But thirdly, you also see that, very simply, if you are numerically disproportionate to the opposing force, you're more likely to lose. And if that's the case, you're just less likely to lose the war as a whole. So we don't see a reason why opening government wants to in fact enter this war as the first place. Why not?
You can tell all the sad stories that you want, but please be competitive and engage with the area where probability of success does come at the expense of the other criteria.
I think I engaged with that argument in like 2 seconds of my speech. I think that's enough, unfortunately for you guys. Firstly, comparatively, why likely waiting increases your probability of success. Given that our stance is that we're fine with temporarily waiting, we think it's the burden on opening opposition then to prove to you why holding our trump cards in our hands means that eventually the chance of success will be higher. We posit 2 structural reasons why. Firstly, if you wait, these rebel forces are more likely to mobilize their own forces and increase their numbers on a higher scale. Under the status quo, if your chance of success is incredibly low, this means that those numbers are also very low. Comparatively, if you wait, you can convince more citizens to join your fight against oppression. This means that waiting allows you to wait for the key chance to strike, given the chance of success can still be high under outside the house eventually. But second, we also think that we still get our message across in the world. People will still know that Palestinians are oppressed. People will still know that Rohingya are slaughtered like cattle. Crucially, we still keep the moral high ground of not engaging in a fight that is not ours to win. Under outside the house, people generally lose support for these people because they perceive it as a fight that is unlikely to achieve any success. They perceive these people as irrational, and it means that comparatively waiting means that we should wait for our trump cards to push us to the brink of success. Opening government will rely on this vague notion of criterion. We're more realistic. I'm very proud.
I thankfully leave the opposition of that speech and call upon Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, Yazid. So like at the start of my journey debating, people have always said that I look like Khalis, and people always say that I am the other Khalis. Well, today after my speech, I will tell you why he's the other M and I am the better Khalis. Number one, let's talk about efficiency of war and whether or not it is actually true that in our side of the house, efficiency is actually compromised. Number two, I will defend the worst case scenario and tell you why a prolonged war is actually a pretty good war at the end of the day. And last, I will tell you why more likely this criterion would only benefit larger states at the end of the day and why we think this is particularly unengaged coming from this side of the house. So first, whether or not a prolonged war is actually existing in outside of the house. The first of which I will respond to is that by the very virtue that some states will more likely have some advantage over other states or other parties, more likely means that your capacity to do things like revamp your military in the instance in which you are depleting your cavalry in comparison to other states means a few things happen. The first, you have more stamina in that war, and it means that even if it is prolonged to some extent and not that extent, we will say that you will experience things like war fatigue and therefore more likely that you're going to stop war easier still in outside of the house. But look, let's defend assuming prolonged war is actually a pretty good thing. The first of which is that we agree to some extent that maybe a prolonged war might happen because both sides of the house are still on a stalemate. But what it means is that both parties of that war knows that none of those things or no military criteria can then win you the war. What do they resolve to next? They will more likely resort to things like diplomacy, knowing that that is the most viable option for them to take, knowing that both sides of the house or both sides of the party is less likely going to win the war. No, thank you. This means that it is better off for for you to do things like A, better reconciliation when it comes to post-war reconstruction, and number two, it is easier to end the war faster when both sides of the house or both sides of the war already knows that they're going to lose or none of them are going to win. So war is more efficient in our because most of them are more likely going to just drop their guns and negotiate diplomacy, and number two, it means that reconciliation and post-war reconstruction becomes better at the end of the day. No thank you. Number two, let's analyze this argument that came from Khalis. To you guys, it's more likely that prolonged war is going to happen in our and it's bad because firstly, they are going to act in instances of desperation, number two, radicalization, and number three, things like post-war stuff. I'll engage one by one. The first, if you notice the criterion that Khalis gives you, no thank you, I don't know where he came up with this UN structure. We would say that, number one, when it comes to ideological support from the people on the ground, knowing that there are other parties that have a disadvantage over other bigger parties, more likely means that the smaller ones are more likely going to go into things like desperation in this side of the house because they have to come up to the same balance of the bigger states on that side of the house. What is the comparative? That's why John told you, particularly in terms of proportionality, bigger states have to stoop down to the level of capacity of smaller states in our, because it means that you have to be proportionate to the size of the threat. Because in this side of the house, it means that the threat that smaller parties have would necessarily be this big and they have to go to this level as compared to ours, but you have to go lower in that sense. This more likely means that radicalization happens more in this side of the house when they have to act in such a way. More likely, in addition to that, so like, Khalis is so annoying. So like, let's look back at why we necessarily think that the criteria that exist in outside of the house is that can't coexist with this criterion. The first is talk about proportionality. It's like Khalis didn't talk anything. It's like it can happen. I don't know why. So firstly is that proportionality assumes that there is a threat onto you and you must act in proportionate to that threat, to that immediate threat. That meant that when it comes to the probability of success, states have to act in a disproportionate advantage in order for them to be successful in comparison to that threat. That would more likely mean that they will amp up their cavalry and amp up their military prowess, and in that sense means that more likely going to act disproportionate to that threat. What is the impact to this? The first, John told you things like A, more likely going to attack things which will cause more collateral damage, extra bombs when it comes to trying to create fear on the people on the ground. This more likely means things like drones. Why is this particularly important? Outside of the house reduces the capacity of these states to act disproportionately to that threat, and more likely means that they are going to reduce the amount of collateral damage that exists. This side of the house then loses on that. Sure, Khalis.
I don't think Bashar al-Assad is going to adhere to a just war criteria. More importantly, you have to debate in the world where intervening in those areas, the scale of conflict you create is a lot higher, which leads to all the harms that we told you you're not engaging with.
Look, Bashar al-Assad will never follow the rules of law even in your side of the house. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to intervention, look, if this criteria already exists in status quo, look what happens in Yemen when the Saudi military had to bomb innocent Shiites within Yemen and kill more individuals. They talked about the intervention within Syria. Look at all the rebel groups that the United States had funded and look what the collateral damage that exists there at the end of the day. No thank you. We say that this criteria is more likely going to incentivize larger states also, and in addition to all of this, more likely going to incentivize larger states. Maybe if they don't go to war, maybe it happens in the best case scenario. We say you create leverage over those smaller countries for other instances, either A, geopolitical hegemony, or number two, economic intervention. And how does that happen? The first, usually states use, or larger states like America, Israel, sometimes Israel in comparison to the Middle East states, and also like places like Russia, oftentimes uses the excuse that we have more probability of winning a war if we to wage war against you as an excuse to use that as leverage over smaller states. That meant that even if they don't go to war in this side of the house, smaller states are still disproportionately disenfranchised when it comes to the bargaining power in terms of negotiations with bigger states. What does that look like? It looks like the United States having a lot of bargaining over things like the Middle East geopolitical area, and that's why they're able to do things like establish military bases in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia without any form of intervention or the capacity to say no. In addition, it also means that the military capacity or hegemony that oftentimes these big countries have meant that they still have more power when it comes to determining economic interventions, when it comes to saying like you should protect the United States' interest because we also already have military bases that we have established because we have leverage over having more probability of success when it comes to waging war. This concludes three things in my speech. The first, a prolonged war meant that it would allow these parties to then act in diplomacy, knowing that both sides of the party is less likely going to win. You disallow larger states to use their leverage to bully smaller states and allow better capacity for these states to have that leverage. I'm so proud to speak.
We're tagging the GPM for that speech now.
Okay, just before I start, Mubarak, Ameer, Sarah, this one is for you, and also Khalis, and this for you, Shine. Alright. Yes, love you guys too. Alright. What leads to less civilian casualties and less conflict? Because so far, OJ has been arguing upon a metric of we will win more wars, therefore that's better for our side. But what we say is that we're more likely to win wars, in which case those individuals are less likely to have longer prolonged wars, which means less civilian death and casualties. There's three things that I'm going to talk about. Firstly, what is the impact and harm of prolonged war? Why you cannot simply come here and say we're okay with having a prolonged war. Secondly, why is it actually their side that incentivizes wars and makes wars more likely to happen? It's something that I'm starting CG from. And thirdly, why the principle should be about prioritizing human life, why you shouldn't fight back, and why I don't think there's inherent value in a resistance. Again, I'm trying to start CG here, which I'm going to succeed. Alright, let's just talk about prolonged war. So the first thing to say here is that when you decide to fight a war where you have a high chance of losing, your stakes and your understanding changes. So notice, right, M's rebuttals towards this was that, you wouldn't, or there's less likelihood that a war would occur in the first place and therefore less civilian casualties will occur. But we think that same thing is still going to happen under our side, right? Because there's still going to be lots of attempt at negotiation. There's still going to be lots of making sure that, I don't want to get into a war in the first place. This debate occurs in a world where that war is about to happen or going to happen, or particularly when there isn't negotiations happening before and another country comes up to your doorstep, what do you have to do about it? There's a few reasons why when you decide to fight a war, you have a chance of losing, things get a lot more bloody. I think the first thing is that as a losing country, you have to start resorting to dirty tactics. So you have to do things like targeting civilians because you don't have the manpower in order to fight high security areas. Secondly, I think you have to radicalize a much larger proportion of your citizens because you need far more manpower in comparison to the other side. So you begin feeding propaganda, you begin feeding them ideas of radicalization, and that means that post-war reconstruction becomes impossible. But thirdly, in a prolonged war, both sides begin running out of bodies and running out of resources, which means citizens get more and more dragged into it, and innocent people who never consented to fighting now begin to have to fight when all they want is necessarily peace. I think this breaks both metrics that we gave you on the outside. Number one, about more citizens dying, and number two, about long-term post-war reconstruction. What was M's response to this? M's response was, as a small country, sometimes you can have more stamina or something like that because war fatigue sets in and therefore you'll end up at a stalemate. So basically what he's saying here is that you can eventually win. Yes, M, maybe you can eventually win, but it will come at a much larger cost of civilians and probably after decades and decades of conflict. But furthermore, right, just because it's more likely, it's still pretty damn unlikely, which means you're still more likely to lose, and the same outcome happens where your individuals were slaughtered for no reason. And this is where the comparative has to happen in this debate, right? Because under our side, we have the solid benefit of less people dying because no war happened in the first place. I think they need to weigh up all of their arguments about the fact that less individuals are going to die because war is just less likely to occur under our side. But even then, comparatively, what did they then say? They then said that, you guys are, we are incentivizing war because there has to be some sort of resistance. I'm going to flip. First of all, at actors, when they go to war, don't care about resistance. They only care about losing. You think Bashar al-Assad cares that there's some resistance? No, he's going to fight no matter what. You think the US cares? You think these big actors care about resistance? And the reason for that is because wars are not decided by the amount of lives lost on the ground. They're decided by corrupt leaders at the top who send these people to die in their cause. But secondly, they like it when people fight back, right? Because you want to create a moral legitimacy that yes, this war is part of it. That's why Israel likes it when Palestinians throw sticks and stones instead of laying down, because that doesn't create moral high ground. But the second thing to say here is that the calculus of actors is actually in making sure that there are prolonged wars in the first place. Because think about who profits from wars, right? It's Boeing, it's Lockheed, it's Russia selling arms. And that means in a side or in a world where more prolonged wars happen, which is your side, countries are more likely to lobby and mobilize for more wars because they know they can sell more arms. The only people who profited from that war were necessarily people who sold the most arms. The third thing they said to this was, now we have some sort of at least we have a bargaining chip. This goes back to the same resistance argument that I was talking about. But I think also our side is far more likely to have a bargaining chip. Why is this? Because you have to understand, the characterization of the outside is not that Russia will be able to annex Ukraine whenever it wants. Countries as a whole still have a huge disincentive from allowing countries to do whatever they want because of self-interest, right? You don't simply want to allow any other country to be able to annex any other country. That's why you create organizations like NATO. That's why you enter into alliances. But thirdly, I think this perfectly goes into our comparative, right? Because the comparative that we push under our side was that instead of instantly creating or striking at a time when you don't have a high probability of winning, we wanted it to strike at a time when you have a much higher likelihood of being able to mobilize your forces and which you actually have a high probability of success, i.e. when you have huge international backing on your side, when you have moral legitimacy on your side, when you have resources on your side, and you don't have to throw away as many lives on your side, which means that comparatively we get a lot more people saved. Last thing that I'm going to talk about is the principle, why should fight back? I'll take closing.
There is no guarantee that international support will arrive. How long are you willing to wait?
No, I don't want to enter into a war at all, right? That's the comparative on the outside. We don't want to allow any war to happen because the comparative is no country goes into a war just to kill other people, right? Israel doesn't go into Palestine just to kill Palestinians. They want land. I say we give it to them temporarily to prevent that war from occurring. Okay, the principle, why we should fight back. First of all, let's talk about prioritization. So human lives are far more important than this vague principle of fighting back that we think is inherently derived from ego. But secondly, notice this is about prioritizing the happiness in their own lives and fighting for what they believe in is right versus the future happiness that is likely to occur from their progeny. But thirdly, notice that most people who go into wars end up not agreeing with it or are conscripted into it anyway. So we cannot say simply that you chose to fight for your life. But secondly, notice, right, the best revenge is living well. So when you analyze how you actually get rights, we would analyze countries like South Africa that attempted to do it peacefully, like Malaysia that attempted to do it peacefully. It's far easier to get rights once you integrate and fight for your rights democratically and peacefully, just because that necessarily means that you're far more likely to come out in greater numbers. There's less likely to be ideological warfare happening against you. There's less likely to just be more lives and more things happening on the ground. For civilians, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
I think the DOI can call on the member of the government to open and close the heart.
Ảnh ở đây thì rất nhanh rồi, nó là phát triển máy mình ảnh kia thì đợi thì nếu mà nó không đỡ phá ảnh. Con này nó về xả ảnh này, không có đi chụp thế, xả hết tầm ảnh, xả ngày rồi đó, xả hết cả ảnh hôm qua. Tức là có thể đi co về nhưng mà lại chụp chém mất ảnh chị đây là không câu chuyện nữa. Chưa sao cả.
If you notice correctly, most of OO's case was based on the idea that a lot of wars happen already, which will be exacerbated. I think this characterization is faulty. The world today barely has wars, and the situation in which wars happen is absolutely extreme. There are structural reasons for this. For war to happen, you need political will of people to outright support it for the forthcoming future. Secondly, you need to have an economy that is willing to bear the costs, both of the short-term intervention and in the long run of the recuperation they talk about. Thirdly, you need UN ratification, whether it's from the Security Council or from a military group, whether it's NATO, that continuously supports you in the long run. What this means is, and fourthly, war is likely to be the last resort at a point in time when all other mechanisms have failed. You've tried to negotiate with these individuals, they've not worked. You've tried to put sanctions, but the existential threat has not been removed. All of this means, if this situation was less significant and the oppression was minimal, all the other alternatives probably would have worked, because there's no point in an oppressive state carrying out little kinds of oppression while simultaneously bearing huge costs of sanctions outright. The only time wars outright and interventions happen is when oppression is at its absolute height, where you have a state out there to get individuals outright and wipe them out, whether it's ethnic cleansing, whether it's systematic targeting of individuals and removal of their rights. That is the frame of this debate. Secondly, this debate is not about people who don't want to get involved. This debate is about actors that want to support these countries and these people but can't go in. They've already consented but are prevented by these standards from entering. Assuming that is the case, just a bit of framing before getting into our case. First, I think the aims that OO tries to set up are way too broad, right? Because if you look at the analysis they give, their definition of success is getting a leader of power, stopping oppression outright, having an opposition to replace and create a stable state, having democracy instead of an autocracy. Whereas they ignore the mini successes, like people living longer, like them getting food and shelter and rights at a point in time when they're losing all these rights because of the oppression that is happening, even if the outright success of the war is not happening. Third framing, what is definition of probability? If probability is 60% failure, by definition that means out of 10 wars, 6 will fail, 4 will succeed. The alternative they have to defend is all 10 circumstances, continuing oppression and continuing of people suffering outright, and like making sure these people systematically lose out on those rights in all 10 cases. Why the 4 is not worth it, and still get to understand clarification for, I expect that from CEO. Before that, yeah, sure. Okay. Before moving on, I think that significantly mitigates and puts us in two contentions and two contextualizations. First, understand this debate only happens in the worst circumstances possible, like Rohingya crisis, where we want to intervene but choose not to because we believe the Myanmar army is backed up by China and the probability of outright success is likely to fail. This is not a debate about many kinds of oppression where a state helps like systematically disenfranchises one minority. With that contextualization, we engage with our extension to the best case scenario of OO and tell you why we win. The best case scenario of OO is more people die. We think we'd rather not give them a right to defend themselves because people dying is bad. I think our extension will deal with this because we think the right to self-defense, whether it's to an alternative third party helping you in the process or you gaining the arms yourself and working coordinatively to stop some kind of oppression onto you, even if it is unsuccessful, is the most important right in this debate and it outweighs any other things. Sure. Opening up.
Oppression happens anyways, but temporary concession still saves more lives because the forced structural reasons you fail to respond to. Engage.
No, the oppression happens anyway at a point in time where you don't intervene and stop it on a mini level. The fact that you give arms to people on a micro level, the fact that you stop them from being shot down and they have something to defend themselves is something that stops oppression. I don't think that's a comparative they can defend. Like if there's literally no use, what is the gov case you expect? We send wars, nothing happens. Like obviously something is supposed to happen. I agree, it can be exacerbated, but on the short-term basis, this is likely to end the conflict, at least in the short run. There's a weird comparative to run. Okay, so why is self-defense the most important important thing in this debate. And this is where we weigh up to the worst case scenario that OO or CO will bring. First, understand that self-defense is something that is guaranteed and is certain, which is to say, your right to defend yourself in the status quo with the weapon that you can get from an intervening party is certain. The probability of whether or not something will happen in the long run and whether or not the country will recuperate is uncertain. I think on a weight of basis, the certainty that we can say that people will survive is significantly more important than presumed uncertainty and presumed probability that there's like vague ways of calculating through uncertainty. No. Secondly, this is literally the only meaning to life for the most oppressed. Why is this so important? Because normal people on a daily basis have access to meaning through a lot of things. They have materialistic happiness, they have security, they have their governments looking out for them. They can wake up knowing that their children are going to be born, go to school, return with a smile on their face. These individuals who are oppressed are put with a tag that says none of this meaning can be accessed in their life. Self-defense is the only way they can fight back against that tag and derive some meaning for their lives. Because literally the worst case scenario of is they die. Guess what? They have no meaning to this life. We give them some meaning in the process of dying. That's a weighing comparative. So the worst case scenario in a lot of cases is second-class citizenship. The best case scenario is death for them. The right to stop this from happening is more important than the outcome of that happening. That's why we allow these people to have some meaning before they die. Thirdly, I think the right to life right now is more important than developing the state for future generations at any point in time. Firstly, because people are born into shitty states all the time. People are born into Africa, they don't consent to it. It's arbitrary. So even if the state goes to shit, people can still be born in it. That's just as arbitrary as any other birth at any other state at any point in time. I'm not sure why this is a presumed consent, while these people have already systematically given their consent that they want their lives to be saved, but have not been saved by the international community that fails to act. So, if you are to protect the rights of individuals and the ability for them to protect their lives, them saying that we want to be saved now is more important than arbitrarily presuming that future generations that live 15 to 20 years later can consent to a certain kind of state, whereas we've seen moral reasons why this happens all the time. Why do we win this debate from CG? Because we debate on the worst case scenario of OO, which is life and death. Even if people die, that is a meaningful death, and that is the only way their life has any kind of meaning. This oppression needs to stop. CO, engage.
I think the member of government in each may call on member of opposition.
Hello.
In both worlds, countries will have political needs and larger countries will want to enter into war for ideological reasons or proxy reasons. This debate is about creating a reasonable barrier where if you are going to enter into a country, you ought not to be able to systematically victimize and create long-term inability for governance, and that we think is the barrier that we ought to create by maintaining this standard. The extension in the closing opposition is going to be threefold. The first, I'll say why this removal of this criteria will likely increase the hegemonic powers that exist in the world and the increase of proxy conflicts. Second, I'll talk about why this exhausts political capital for wars that we actually do need to enter, where there's a higher likelihood of success, where we're unlikely to enter into those. And third, why forcing people to enter into a stalemate to finally enter diplomacy removes the ability for entering diplomacy earlier in a more sustainable way. Before I go into any of that, let's take out closing government out of this debate. There are two things I want to talk about. First is this right to self-defense nonsense. The first thing I'll say is the right to self-defense is premised on only one thing, that the alternative is definitely dying. So all I have to prove is that if this right of self-defense creates more deaths, then you're not giving self-defense, you're killing people, which is more likely to be true, because in a world in which the probability of success is very low, the stalemate often results in more and more people getting constricted, higher amounts of individuals and inability to access basic goods and services. You don't create self-defense, you force people into enter circumstances where they're more likely to die than they are to succeed. Second, they say there's no meaning to life, so you might as well have a gun before you die. The first thing I'll say is a lot of people are manipulated and forced to enter the army. Like Syria, for example, became a proxy battleground state, and they had to have more and more people join the forces because it could counter against a larger force that entered. The Russian military, for example. So you don't create a meaning of life. You force people to enter circumstances they didn't want to. But third, if I can prove that we can have more diplomacy and likely to come to a resolution in this, that means this isn't the only meaning of life. We have an alternate meaning of life. Therefore, we think CG is out of debate. Rest of my material will be integrated. First, let's talk about why we think we are better able to cripple hegemonic powers. Opening government suggests that bigger countries are likely to use this criteria to squash smaller countries because they will enter and they'll say, aha, I'm going to win. The first thing I'll suggest is, in our world where the criteria of probability, all the other criteria they say also exist, in our world you have to prove that you're going to win. We say this is one barrier from countries like China or Russia who don't even have to prove that they're likely to win, but just enter based on the fact that they want to support their communist ideology. As we saw in the Vietnam War, we think creating one more barrier for countries that want to enter means that the larger countries are likely to not be able to enter in some circumstances. Because if the US says I'm more likely to win and they want to enter into a war, they will do it in both wars anyway. It's not as if they are not going to be able to do it, but it's about the countries that don't meet this criteria. We think those countries are going to remove their ability to enter. What are the examples of this? First thing I would suggest is Yemen. Look, we agree that Saudi Arabia and Iran have entered into Yemen, but the largest diplomatic push for them to leave Yemen because they are involved in a proxy conflict is that you can't win that war. You are literally pumping money into a war where you are losing political capital. You're unlikely to be able to pull out. That's the single reason why Saudi Arabia has pulled back some of its money. Iran has been diplomatically pushed by the United Nations to remove themselves. The second is Trump and North Korea. Look, Trump has always said we're going to bomb the hell out of North Korea, and everyone just looks at him, dude, that's not going to work, they just nuke you. This is the single reason for why Trump has removed his ability, his push for war and moved to diplomacy, going to the Singapore summit. These things mean that hegemonic powers don't have the ability to abuse the system and use this to enter whenever the hell they freaking want to. We think this is a world in which we protect smaller countries from being victimized, because in your world, smaller countries don't have anything to say. On top of the fact that larger countries don't even have to prove they win, they will just enter wholesale all the time, because guess what? They don't have anything to prove as a result of their model. That's our first extension. Before I go to the second one, go for it, closing.
So you presume that the alternative to current oppression is war, but what is the moral difference between oppression, which is a constant threat to life in the worst off, and war, which is a constant threat to life?
It is a scale. In your world, there will be more death, there will be more war, so you have harms that are worse. You have to deal with the scale, otherwise you don't win that argument. Second, political capital. When the United States decided to enter into Vietnam, it was huge amounts of fear-mongering that put money into Vietnam. But halfway through, they realized there were hundreds of thousands of people who have died, millions and millions of dollars are gone, and after when they left preemptively, what happened was people became so scared of entering into war. They decided in no other circumstances am I ever going to enter war, because the stalemate that the opening government says is a great thing is actually quite a cost for the citizens in the United States, citizens in the developed world. As a result of this, the next time they needed to enter into the war, Rwanda, where there was an actual likeliness of success, where the RAF was quite weak, people were irrational and they suggested we don't want to incur the same cost, we ought not to enter this war. This means if the government bets they don't enter wars when they need to, because you preemptively enter all kinds of random wars. When the time comes, if you exhaust the political capital, you don't get to recuperate the amount of time you need to enter into wars that are necessary. This means when there is a decision of which war to enter into, we think people make the decision preemptively based on ideologies. You remove the capacity to enter wars when you necessarily need them. The third extension, let's talk about why we think this harms diplomacy. Look, opening government very happily concedes they will wait for stalemate in their world, and at that point people will enter into conflict. The first thing I'll suggest is stalemate actually doesn't force individuals to enter into diplomacy. Like look at Russia and look at the conflict battle that exists. Every time you enter into a stalemate, people will suggest we're pumping more money into Assad's regime, we're more likely to win the war because we're going to keep on funding out into it. Stalemate doesn't incentivize diplomacy, it incentivizes us to keep going because you don't know who is going to win, you don't know who is going to lose. The only time diplomacy is likely to happen is when there is no other alternative except to talk. In a world in which there is a higher barrier to enter war, we think more and more countries will be pushed into diplomacy earlier, so you don't have to wait for the stalemate in the opening government or the closing government. You can enter into diplomacy likelier. Why is this true? Two reasons. The first is, upon realizing larger countries, for example like the United States, that they're unlikely to win the war in Syria, and they can't send boots onto the ground because of UN pressure, international pressure, we think they're likely to resort to diplomatic talks. For example, when we wanted to remove Syria's ability to have some form of nuclearization, we looked at the IAEA and we had them intervene inside those things. These things are only likely to happen faster in our world and not rely on diplomacy to exist. The second thing I want to talk about is why we think a stalemate is actually quite counterproductive to diplomacy. In a world in which it's a stalemate, the person in power always has the control. So for example, in Syria, where there is currently a stalemate, the person in control is Assad. And the person that is in control has no incentive to enter into diplomacy because he knows Russia will back him no matter what. Once the probability of success is depleted and you know that war no longer is sustainable, we think you What's our worst case scenario? Assuming there's no diplomacy, assuming the war prolongs forever, a couple of things. First, we are more than happy to spot a flaring out of the war. You can beat the shit out of each other and you can fight. The arms will end up running out. The economy will end up becoming weaker. You can sanction them. These things mean that the war will end faster. We would support a world in which these three things are preferable. Because to be quite honest, the right of self-defense is circumstantial. They don't think they get in all circumstances. But more importantly, you allow a monopoly by hegemonic powers. For all those reasons, you must maintain these criteria within the just war theory.
Let's take CEO out first. They think that the probability of success is the reason that hegemonic powers stop. But isn't probability of success the criteria that the hegemonic powers can use the most in their favor? Like, notice how the US, China, Russia are hugely more powerful than any other country, any other actor that exists throughout the world. Which is to say that if they want to prove that they have the capacity to destroy a particular force, no matter in which way they are oppressive or in which way they are ideologically framed, they can literally claim it at any point in time. But more importantly, there are other criteria there that can stop them. The criteria of just cause that is embedded within the just war theory. The idea of proportionality that is embedded within the just war theory. So, I think we've forgotten how America entered Iraq. They claimed that there was weapons of mass destruction there. The probability of success was never up for debate because everyone knew America entering Iraq. America has the power, capability and force to enter and destroy into Iraq. And more importantly, we think that the idea of just cause, when it comes to Saudi Arabia entering Yemen, like if they actually followed the just war frame, they had to prove just cause. I don't think they had a just cause at that point in time. I don't think this just war frame that is used around internationally is something that these actors abide by to begin with. So that extension was extremely ridiculous. But more importantly, Rwanda wasn't stopped because of what they say it was. Rwanda was stopped because the people all around the West felt that the Vietnam War was a failure, and therefore it was the probability of success criteria that stopped individuals from entering Rwanda, and that's the biggest problem. If you remove the probability of success clause, if it meets every other clause there is, just cause, proportionality, and the fact that all other alternatives have been exhausted, at that point in time, isn't it more likely that we would have entered Rwanda and saved oppressed people from there? We think that is quite reasonable. CEO is up. So let's understand. What CO engages to in terms of CG is that self-defense is actually premised on the certainty of dying. Whether or not you will die, if there's a greater probability that you will die, and that in and of itself defines self-defense. And secondly, you can be manipulated. First one, you can be manipulated. Let's understand that there is a reasonable amount of willingness to engage here, because recognize the actors that are engaging in war, whether it is the oppressed group or whether it is a third party that is willing to engage here, has a reasonable amount of willingness, either on the majority of the people that exist here, but more on the willingness to engage against the oppressors, because otherwise how will you fight the war to begin with? So we can presume that in a lot of instances these individuals have the agency to decide that, because as we said, it has to be proportional. So I think the idea of proportionality is missing from all of our bench, because recognize war essentially means taking away of lives. For war to be an option on the basis of proportionality, they are already probably taking away lives, right? At that particular point in time, it matches the criteria of proportionality and it matches the criteria of big proportion. But we are going to tell you that death for these people is something that they, when they choose, by their agency, is something that provides more meaning to them. Because their identity so far has been constructed around oppression. They have been oppressed for so long that they believe that they cannot act. They have been oppressed for so long. They believe that they have to be subhuman. The only thing that can bring them out of these shackles of an oppressed identity is an ability to act. Is the power against the oppression, taking up arms in their own hands and saying, I am not subhuman, I am human like you. And the only way this happens is if they take up arms and if they engage in self-defense. We tell you that at that point in time, if they're given proper agency, they will prefer an identity that is resilient rather than a subhuman identity. They tell you that this self-defense is framed around ego. We don't think that's true, because as Sajid characterized to you, these people have literally no access to meaning in their lives. Consider slavery and the slaves who were field slaves and house slaves back in the time of slavery. At that point in time, we don't think they had any access to meaning in their lives rather than serving their masters. In the modern era, when you are a Rohingya and you are a second-class citizen, your government does not recognize you, you're not given schools, you're not given healthcare, you're not given anything, then according to O, you'd rather wait for a time when you have some trump card to uproot the Myanmar government? No. We would rather take up arms, we would rather stand up against the Myanmar government, and we would rather establish that our identity is more important. Because recognize, on the scale of meaning to human lives, if you don't do anything, if everything is taken away from you, then the amount of net happiness that you gain is essentially negative. Because your experience is negative. You are likely to be affected on an emotional and subhuman level when your government does not recognize you and the majority of people does not recognize you, when you're denied access to anything in regards to food, healthcare, etc. At best, you have some meager opportunities and stuff like that. Worst case is, they die. Death is zero. We would rather prefer zero over a negative existence of human lives. I think that is the scale that they need to engage to in terms of oppressed identities. Before I move on, closing and respond, opening.
Even in your examples, it has not led to stopping of wars, it has only led to prolonged wars. I already rebutted this when I told you that the highest actors don't care about the people on the ground, they care about the amount of citizens dying. That means you actually get more people dying under your side.
Not necessarily. We would rather have a prolonged war under our side if that is the best case of that we want to engage to. Because given that if you don't go for a prolonged war, O's characterization of oppression isn't true. Oppression in and of itself, without any form of war means, yes, war means you have conflict outside your home. Oppression in the vast majority of instances means you have to live in fear of army coming into your house and killing you. You have to live in fear of the police coming into your house and killing you. This is literally the state in places such as Kashmir and the Arakan state of Myanmar. I don't think their characterization and comparative is true. But the only thing that they would have is, oh, but we want a better life for our future generation than for our current generation. Because presumably it's the current generation that's making that willing choice to act in self-defense. We tell you that the future generation at this point has no agency, but the current generation does. Which is to say that their ability to choose self-defense over anything else is not something that we can know for certain. But the current generation engaging in that act of self-defense is something that we know for certain. But more importantly, even if you ask that future generation later on, say 20, 30 years down the line, if they ask you, when the height of oppression was at its peak, when structures were systematically crippled, for which the country in the future right now means that you have no access, no systematic access to any opportunities, wouldn't the future generation, in a lot of instances, have asked you to have engaged in war and rather construct an identity that is resilient over an identity that is oppressed and is secondary to another identity? We would rather have that, and incredibly proud to propose.
Well, you can't take over anyway for that speech, now you call upon the opposition to not take away.
The comparative in this debate is not death versus no death. It is death and
more death. Because your side is the one that says people, in order to have a meaningful life, must take up guns. These are not only adults, these are children that you're also asking to take up guns. Which means that when you're putting yourself in the battlefield, I don't know why no death suddenly becomes a reality when literally on your side, people are dying. That is the single reason why self-defense is not an argument, because they are not supporting the protection of the people, they are literally supporting the complete killing of these individuals. The first thing I'm going to do is defend Amrit's extension, which was poorly responded to by closing opposition. We had three things to say. Number one, if you have this criteria, what you do is you significantly reduce the power struggles of hegemonies and proxy wars. The reason why this is true is because this criteria requires states to first justify that when they want to fund a proxy war or when they want to intervene into a certain area, they need to be able to show that there is a high probability of success. Because without having that probability of success, all the explanation of why war becomes the last resort is more likely to happen on the outside because you suffer at higher political costs. You are unable to gain the United Nations ratification. So it's unclear why Sajid can come up here and say war is only going to be a last resort, because that's an explanation of why status quo works and it's not comparative to why it's likely to also exist when the other literally removes that barrier. Their only response to this is, the US and China are really big, they'll do anything that they want. No, that's not true. Because having a barrier means the United States and China has to first decide if the political cost that comes from participating into the war is something they can trade off on their side. If they can deal with the complete shaming that you get in the United Nations itself. Whilst it might not be sanctions, the political cost of having reputational damage is what is a barrier that we have on our side. This is the deterring value that they fail to engage in. You cannot just say you have the just war criteria, because that's not mutually exclusive. We all have that just war criteria. In fact, we have more barriers that prevent you from first opting into the war. No, thank you. Secondly, war exhaustion. Opening opposition talks about like when the army is exhausted, we will just conscript more individuals. So like, it's quite mad. Why is our argument better? Because when the United States entered into Vietnam, choosing to exist on our side, rather it was because they faced so much reputational damage, they faced so the continuous support or continuous incentive being we must constantly fight, only then can we decide a certain winner. They failed to respond to why negotiations were most likely to happen. They only said that people ought to take up guns. We say people ought to go to the discussion table when they know they are losing legitimacy. That means we are likely to bring a more peaceful outcome. Now, let's talk about closing government. They basically repeated the argument from the world's finals for self-defense, stuff like that. So, their frame to this is that there's political considerations, there's UN ratification, which makes it the last resort. This frame is uncomparative and does not work for them. Because that is an explanation of why we are most likely to reduce the entries into war. In your world, you don't need political support, you don't need the United Nations ratification, because reasonable probability of success is no longer part of your consideration. If you merely have a threat that you like to engage into, yes, you may be able to apply proportionality, maybe apply just wars, but that's one less reason for why the explanation you give works for you, rather it becomes significantly weakened on your side. Which means that when you talk about the legitimacy of self-defense, I think it's not valuable for these individuals because it's only illegitimate. This argument is uncomparative to the actual reality of when you take out guns, because they need to prove how large amounts of people taking out guns means you're likely to bring an end to the conflict and therefore reduce that, because the likelihood of your success is significantly reduced when you constantly coerce people and you tell them in schools that you should take up guns and you should go and fight because you've constantly been oppressed. This use of propaganda is coercive to individuals, because if you claim you want meaning for these individuals, you're not giving them that opportunity to decide, you're robbing off that autonomy for them. Why is this important? Because the continuous loss of lives or the trauma that they go through means that the ability for them to at least have a generation to sustain the future becomes significantly depleted. Go ahead. Assuming alternatives fail, you need to have a mechanism of your alternative and how it solves the conflict for any of your extensions to make sense on a comparative view. In our world, the alternatives will not fail, because we don't have to go all the way to the end of continuous amounts of conflict that you are most likely to have in a larger amount, which means that the scale doesn't operate on your side. You're unlikely to be able to first get the benefit of negotiations, which we get on our side. What happens when you have more loss of life and you have a greater traumatized generation? You have more fatigue and you have trauma in these individuals. I don't know why that is a meaningful version of self-defense you can give them, because what you're ultimately doing is telling them to live in a continuous circle of violence. Secondly, let's also talk about which countries ought to enter into self-defense. These are likely to be smaller countries, right? So if they are not being aggressors and participating into war, I think they already remove them from their calculus, because you remove the need for a perpetrator to continuously be an aggressor onto you. For these individuals, these are larger countries that are most likely to enter into those areas. But if you remove one last reason for them to participate in those wars, the amount of conflict or the extent of conflict itself is likely to be decreased. In that regard, even if you claim that there's a big country, small country imbalance, this model does not change that imbalance. It just gives one more reason for big countries to fuck over all the small countries in their world.
I